I'm going to keep my glasses on. I get told by Kate Hoey, with whom I've established quite a strong friendship as a result of my endeavours for Northern Ireland, that I look better with my glasses off. But I can actually see you if I've got my glasses on. And I do take them off when I'm on telly because of Kate, because every time I have them on, she texts me afterwards and said, "You look bloody awful. Take them off next time." Anyway, they're on. Thank you very much, Bruce, for that kind introduction. Thank you very much to all of you in this room, giving up your Thursday night to be here. What distinguishes you, I think, from just about every other politician is that you're here because you've got convictions. And that cannot be said for career politicians. And what we want, I think what this country needs desperately, is more people like you in the front line of politics to be making the case for that which we need in order to rescue the United Kingdom. No one gives up their Thursday night because they're in it for you're not even getting a free drink, are they?
No.
You've got a collection box.
Free tickets.
But the question that I ask myself, and a question that has kept me in politics for the last 6 years, is how is it that from when I was a boy at rugby school, when it was taken for granted that the United Kingdom was a great country, that our history was phenomenal, that the British Empire was the best empire that the world had ever seen, that the sun never set on the British Empire, that we went abroad and we built schools, we built railways, we endowed people with industrial capability, we exported our common law. We were basically a force for good. That's how I was brought up. How many people in the room were brought up with that kind of belief? And how many people think that that kind of belief is still being instilled in our children? Hands up if you think that that is the basic building block of a sort of proud British education that our youth are getting. Any hands? One hand. Okay, that's cool. I suppose that's the exception that proves the rule. So how do we get here? How is it that we went from believing in our country to eschewing that which defines the nation state? And it's troubled me, and we all have to try and make sense of the current political landscape. And the way I came to understand it, and I believe this to be the case, is that we have become too complacent in accepting that we live in what we all say, quite readily and accept, a liberal democracy. It's rolled off people's tongues all the time. We live in a liberal democracy. Aren't we great? We live in a liberal democracy. What I think people don't really appreciate, and it's taken me a while to get there, is that liberalism is essentially in opposition to democracy. Liberalism is the identifying of individual rights and the promotion of individual rights. Democracy is the identifying of what's in the interests of the majority, which doesn't always go with what's in the interests of the individual. And we've lived in this tension between liberalism and democracy, I think probably ever since the suffragettes made the case for women being emancipated. And liberalism, in that respect, has been a phenomenal force, because if it wasn't for liberalism, we wouldn't have had the progress that we've had in establishing equal rights for women, bringing them into the workplace, emancipating women, and so on. And of course, humanity has to have some sense of equality when it comes to their treatment by government. So liberalism has been a necessary and helpful tension in many respects. But ultimately, what you need for a nation state to do well, what you need for the United Kingdom to do well, are values that promote democracy, that promote the majority's interest. And the problem, I think, that we now face in this country is that liberalism has taken control, and the rights of the individual trump those of the majority. Indeed, the majority are often described by those on the liberal side of the debate as the sort of tyranny. Have you heard the expression tyranny of the majority? And it's a very clever choice of words because it's designed to promote liberalism at the expense of democracy. So when you hear people saying, I'm a libertarian, I'm sure most of you, all of us, I'm a libertarian too. I want people to be able basically to do that which they wish to with their lives, and they should have every opportunity to do that which they wish to with their lives. But when it becomes an opposition between the individual and the majority, if we want a prosperous, identifiable nation state to continue going forward, it is the majority's interests that have to prevail. You cannot maintain a democracy if it's not the majority's interests that prevail. And we've got to this very peculiar position now where the individual's rights are so important that if you're an immigrant, for example, from a culture which is antithetical to ours, you come to the United Kingdom and we say, we recognize your right to be an individual. We recognize your right to hold your cultural values and your religious values and so on. And we will not challenge you in the views that you hold. In fact, because we care so much for the promotion of your interests, we will put a protective blanket around you and we will ensure that the tyranny of the majority cannot attack you. And we've embedded this into our system. It's not, when we talk about woke, woke is not a social fad. Woke is a regulatory and legislative fad that has been brought in deliberately. So the description of the regulatory framework is effectively diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's nothing diverse, equal, or inclusive about DEI. DEI is all about the protection of minority interests, the promotion and celebration of minority interests expressly to the detriment, if necessary, of the majority. And what we've therefore got in this country is the taking in, this is effectively what's happened, the taking in of mass immigration, and we've seen that particularly in the last 5 years, with a protective blanket put around the people who've been coming to this country, promoting their interests, and I'll come back to how we've promoted their interests, to the detriment of the British people. And that has resulted in what I call multicultural silos being created across the United Kingdom. Diversity, in the sense that we've created it, is not a diversity of thought. It's not lots of different cultures coming together and having robust debate with each other, integrating as a result of that robust debate, and going forward as some kind of new homogenous settled culture for the United Kingdom. The way we've done it, by putting this protective blanket around foreign cultures, is to say, actually, you know, we're not going to require you to sing the national anthem. We're not going to require you to sign up to our Christian values. We're not going to require you to understand our history. Actually, we'll rewrite our history and we'll claim that all our forefathers were slave traders and they were all bloomin' evil, just so that you feel comfortable. And moreover, we'll set aside meritocracy because we all want you to have jobs. So it's not about meritocracy anymore. It's about ticking boxes and making sure that you've got the right element of ethnic makeup, minority, transgender makeup, or whatever it is in your workforce. And I know this very well because I run a public company, and it's also governed, registered, it's regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. And under my FCA obligations and my stock exchange obligations, I have to report to the stock exchange on the ethnic mix of my company, senior executives, what we're doing for ESG. I'm sure you've all heard of ESG, environmental, social governance. And we have basically hijacked, liberalism has hijacked that which is healthy for the country. If you set aside meritocracy in order to employ people based on their ethnic background or religious beliefs, you're actually damaging the economy, aren't you? So when you hear the Conservative Party or the Labour Party saying, oh, we're not going to get caught in the culture wars, it's not just about culture. What we're talking about is damaging the economic ecosystem of the United Kingdom. We're actually setting aside our own economic benefit and the benefit of the people of this country in order to make way for this, what I call extreme liberalism, liberalism on steroids. And we need to yank back at liberalism. Liberalism, in its purest form, informs you that it doesn't matter if you're a British citizen, French, German, Pakistani, Indian, Guatemalan, Nigerian, we're all equal. Makes sense, doesn't it? Because if you believe in the rights of the individual, who cares what nationality you are? And it is through this liberal global order that immigration has been championed. Indeed, those who believe in liberalism in the way that I've just described it hold nation states and democracy in contempt, because democracy and nation states stand in the way of the promotion of the individual. So I'm laboring the point, but it's really important to understand how it is that we got to where we are. And if you believe in this liberal order, then actually immigration is a fantastic thing. Because when you bring lots of immigrants in to the country with lots of different cultural backgrounds and belief systems, you make it that much more difficult for the indigenous population to exercise their sense of family, community, and nation state and society. You make it much more difficult for the nation state to exist. And that's what liberals want. They want governance internationally. They want governance for the globe. They don't want governance for the United Kingdom. Those of us who read Commando mags as children, did anyone read Commando mags? Well, we were the good guys in every single Commando mag. They don't want you to think you're the good guys, because if you think you're the good guys, you may be prepared to fight for your country. And it's no surprise, therefore, I don't know if you saw this, the results of this survey a few weeks ago, that less than 40% of the youth who were polled in this poll would actually fight for the United Kingdom. And it's because they're constantly told how awful the country is. And in order to foster this liberal approach, that is what we have to take on board. So the real problem here that the United Kingdom is facing, the real problem that Western civilization is facing, and until recently the United States was facing, was an assault by liberalism on our democratic rights. And we should be very, very proud in the UK, because when we voted to leave the EU in 2016, it was the first Western civilized country that recognized the need to break with the global liberal order. The British people saw it first. And I take great hope from that. I didn't understand what was going on really in the depth that I understand it now back in 2016. I just wanted to get rid of that awful organization in Brussels. Yeah. But I see now what Brussels is. Brussels is not just it's not just undemocratic, it is anti-democratic. They stand against nation states. And so when we stand in the UK and we look across the channel, we should want a proud France. We should want a proud Germany. We should want a proud Netherlands, Italy, and so on. But Brussels doesn't want that. It wants to destroy nation states, and it's created this crazy Schengen zone through which any illegal migrant can walk without being checked. Nation states have literally, in Europe, taken their borders down. And if you don't have borders, you cannot be a country. If you don't have a broadly integrated culture, if you don't have a broadly homogeneous culture, you cannot be a society. You cannot be a country. And that is what they're doing. And the people look at the Conservative Party, they look at the Labour Party, and they think, how is it that the Conservative Party has done so much that was done by how is it they continued the program of the Labour government before them? Why was it that they didn't reverse all of it? It's because the Conservative Party is part of the liberal global order. It is the concept of left and right no longer exists. Bruce was absolutely spot on when he talked about, briefly in the introductory comments, about traditional lefties actually being more like us. Because traditional lefties believe in the nation state. It's the new lefties, this sort of extreme liberal globalism, and that's why we call it the Uniparty, because the Conservative Party is not conservative. It's actually part of the liberal global order. And Kemi Badenoch has one hell of a job on her hands because of the 120 MPs she's got. I'd say about 10% of them are of our disposition, 10% of them are Liberal Democrats, the rest of them are kind of cannon fodder. And she has this difficult job of riding this horse, which wants to go this direction here and that direction there. And that's the problem with the Conservative Party. So Reform, which was a party that I reluctantly joined, and I can answer questions on why I was reluctant to join Reform, but I reluctantly joined in March 2023, was a critical component, was critically required for the country in order to set a completely different agenda for how we're run. We don't need minor variations in the way the country is governed. We need a 180-degree change from the way things are done. We need a Trumpian revolution in the United Kingdom. Now, a lot of what Trump is doing, all of what Trump is doing, is pro-America. A lot of what he's doing is going to be very harmful to us. I hope you understand that. Tariffs, for example, a requirement to, though I completely agree with him, a requirement to step up and actually do our fair share of defending Europe, and so on. All of that is going to burden us. It's going to be problematic. And some people will look at Trump in the near to midterm future, and they will say, we don't like what Trump is doing because it's hurting the United Kingdom. But this is the kind of hurt we need. We need to be woken up. We need to recognize that the only way to survive as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is to take a leaf out of what Trump is doing. And we therefore need two things. The first is a proper diagnosis of the problem and a proper understanding of the agenda that's required to resolve the problem. And I'm afraid neither the Conservative Party, and sadly under Nigel Farage, nor does Reform, offer up the agenda that's required. I thought Nigel got it. I mean, I've always known Nigel was a narcissist, but I thought he understood what it meant to be British. And for reasons I can explain during Q&A, I actually don't think Nigel really fully understands what the United Kingdom is about, nor do I think Nigel has a properly joined up political, philosophical framework. I'm very sorry to report that to you. And I even question, and a lot of you are going to roll your eyes, and you may have heard me say this on media channels, I even question whether Nigel is really truly a Brexiteer. Now that some of you will really find that difficult to comprehend, and I'll explain it in Q&A if you wish me to. So before we get to the point where everyone says, you know, we've got too many right-wing parties, you're splitting the vote, we've got to get rid of Starmer, we've got to get the Tories in, or we've got to get Reform in, or before we get there, we've got to understand what the hell it is we wish to do when we get there. And it's not about reform, small r reform. You've had David Starkey speaking to you, so it's not for me to go over the ground that he's already, I'm sure, brilliantly put forward. But it's not about reform. We've had far too much reform in this country in the last 27 years, 28 years, far too many experiments with what had been a very settled and comfortable position. The way that the United Kingdom evolved was not through seismic change, not through dramatic movements. Our democracy and our stability and position in the world was established because we did everything incrementally. We debated everything. We moved at actually quite a slow pace. And under Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and then David Cameron, we've had far too much dramatic change. And the most dramatic change, of course, is immigration and the protective blanket put around people who've come to this country. And we need to reverse all of that. And any incoming government, we've got to make sure, it is our collective responsibility to make sure that any incoming so-called colloquially right-wing, and by the way, by right-wing, I don't mean right-wing, I mean people who actually just believe in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Just keep saying that to yourself. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That's what we want to champion. That's what we need to protect. It's the interests of that entity. It's the democracy of that entity. It's the people of that entity that we need to protect and promote. That is what the United Kingdom is. That is who we are. If we lose sight of that, there's no point being independent. There's no point having borders. There's no point having sovereignty, because we aren't what we're not a nation state. So we need a government that comes in and reestablishes that nation state and reestablishes that democratic unit. Liberalism needs a good kicking, and we need to reinforce democracy. We need more of the majority. And the first step in all of that is to repeal everything that's happened in the last 28 years. Just about everything. If you get exhausted in government repealing things, that means you just got to repeal a bit more. And any right-wing government, I use the term colloquially as I mentioned, any coming in, has to have an agenda to do that. It has to do the equivalent of the 100 executive orders that Trump did in his first hour of presidency instantly. And that's why I agreed to join the Great British Political Action Committee as its chairman, because I could see that the Conservative Party and Reform, this is before the whole Rupert Lowe thing kicked off. I mean, I thought that Nigel's persona would carry him through, and that we would need something like the GB Political Action Committee to keep Nigel honest and try and pull the Tories over to some kind of honest, small c Conservative position. And the essence of the Great British Political, it's got basically four aims, the GB PAC. The first is to shift the center of gravity of acceptable political discourse from the far left position in which we now find it, where if you were to say that Islam poses a challenge to our democracy, you get categorized as Islamophobic. If you say that immigrants pose a challenge to our democracy, you get categorized as racist, as xenophobic. We've got to move the center of gravity back to a position where actually we believe in our country, that we're proud of our country, we're proud of our history, and that we understand that policy needs to be made for our betterment, not for the world's betterment. So we've got to yank the center of gravity of discourse to the right. Unless we do that, we can't actually have an honest debate about what the country needs. So the GB PAC is going to do that. Then the second thing we need are proper policies. Again, political parties are so torn and so obsessed with the 24-hour news cycle, they never really sit down and do any introspection about what's really needed in terms of policy. So we're going to do that for the political parties. And we've got if you go to greatbritishpac.com, you'll see a planning policy platform where you can put your ideas forward. And we're going to sift through those ideas and come up with some kind of coherent, popular set of policies. The other thing that I'm sure you're very familiar with is through the two-party system. In the pursuit of promoting party interests, the interests of the nation have been set aside, and parties have increasingly taken on what I would regard as suboptimal candidates to be MPs. And you see this. That was a joke, by the way. I was expecting a bit of laughter there.
Sorry.
But they're all pretty useless, aren't they? And so the other thing the GB PAC is going to do is identify candidates who have a grasp of the issues that we're facing, come from all spectrums of life, can make the arguments required to be made, and then have the ability to actually plan and execute those policies and so on when they get into government. And then the last thing is where I started a little while ago, is a kind of legislative agenda that we would need to implement instantly. And People overcomplicate it, you know. They say, oh my goodness, there's so much to do. Actually, I say burn the house down. Burn everything that they've done. And we might make mistakes in burning legislation. We might cause a few disruptions, but we will cease to exist as a country unless we take that kind of approach. We need to burn it down. I was very disappointed. I know there are conservatives in this room. I was very disappointed with Kemi Badenoch when she was in charge of trade and she was given responsibility of the Retained EU Law Act. Do you remember this Retained EU Law Act? So the purpose behind the Retained EU Law Act was to remove the 4,500 regulations made in Brussels that had never been debated by our Parliament. Don't be misled. People say, well, our Parliament adopted them. These are regulations made in Brussels over which we had no say. And the Retained EU Law Act gave Kemi Badenoch the opportunity to repeal all those regulations instantly. And she came out and she said, I can't do that because that would create a legislative vacuum. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the British law system works, a law system that actually has enabled global trade to take place the way it did and enabled our empire. And the reason I say that is because it's the European model that requires laws to exist in order for people to be able to do things. The European model says, unless there's a law that allows you to do something, you can't do it. The British system, our traditional system, which is absolutely a cornerstone of why we were such a great country, basically says you can do whatever you want unless the law says you can't. And so when she talked about a legislative vacuum, she was completely wrong. We should just tear everything out and go back to our commonsensical, freewheeling, entrepreneurial, Anglo-Saxon nature, which is to do whatever we want, whenever we want. And it is only through that kind of approach that we can reinstill wealth creation, aspiration, and so on. And I'm going to finish now. I don't know how long I've been speaking, probably far too long. But I was very depressed a few months ago, before Trump got elected. I was very depressed because I was looking at Nigel in office and thinking, oh, Nigel is leader of Reform, and thinking the nation don't really see him for what he is. And he's not going to deliver the kind of reform that we need, which is a restoration rather than reform. And I was looking at the Tories, and if you ever look at the Tories, you inevitably get depressed. And I was thinking, how do we go forward from here? And then Trump was elected. Actually, I don't know if anyone in this room watched the election. Did anyone watch the US election? Yeah. So as it unfolded overnight, I had a sense of deja vu. I thought, my God, it looks like he might win, which means at the last minute he'll be robbed of his victory. And I was absolutely stunned that he won. 5 a.m., the sort of news came in that Trump is the president of the United States of America. And look, he's a really weird bloke. He says really weird things. His way to articulate stuff is not something that we're accustomed to in this country. But what he's doing, what he stands for, is phenomenal. And I went back to sleep at 5 a.m. thinking, oh, that's good. And then I was driving into work at sort of 8:30, having got up and showered and whatever. And as I was driving into work, I felt this enormous weight lift off my shoulders as I reflected on the dramatic change that Western civilization was going to experience now that he had been elected. Of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we haven't got there. But my goodness, he's made one hell of a start. And that, I think, gives me the most hope. The second reason I have hope is because reform is being revealed for what I understood it to be. And that is not because I'm bitter and twisted. And if anyone wants to sing "The Sun Has Got His Hat On," hip hip hooray. Do you know why I say that? You probably don't. Anyway, you've got to follow Nigel quite closely to understand why I just said that. But I'm not bitter and twisted. We need this debate now. We need to have it out. We need Kemi and Nigel to have it out. And if they can't have it out and get the right agenda for the United Kingdom, we need some other force to emerge. And the GB PAC is going to help to do that. And so I feel very optimistic with Trump making the arguments he's making, delivering the changes he's delivering across the Atlantic, in the biggest Western democracy that there is, that the United Kingdom might rediscover what it means to be British. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.